Okay, on the show today, history YouTuber Rudyard William Lynch. So, Rudyard is the founder of Whatifalthist, which many of you have actually probably seen. I still struggle to say it. I've been a fan of his. I've seen his stuff on. It used to be like alternative history, like what if Germany won World War II or something. Then it for more classic history. There's a lot of politics in there, geopolitics, and just a really thoughtful view of the world. My colleague Steve, who I works with a lot, is a massive fan as well. And I think you're one of the YouTube channels we find ourselves most often, just when we're shooting the shit, when we're hanging out. It's one of the ones we're most often saying, oh, did you see what he said about this? And do we agree? Do we disagree? So I think this will be fascinating. Welcome.
Thank you very much. You're too kind. Glad to be here.
Yeah, a pleasure. So first of all, thank you for all the awesome videos. How did you get into making a YouTube history channel? It's not a sort of job you apply for, at school.
I'm 22 now, and I started on my 13th birthday, largely out of boredom. So I've been doing it for what's going to be 10 years soon. And the reason I started it is I was really into alternate history at the time. And for those that don't know, that's like, what if the Nazis won the Civil War? What if the South won World War II? But it's that sort of thing where you try to figure out what would happen in the timeline afterwards. And I wanted to make stuff in the space because it was a very elementary and young space. And I thought that I could make good alternate histories. And so I did alternate history for the first 7 years. And an interesting thing you find is when I did alternate history, there were two other big alternate history channels, those being Alternate History Hub and Monsieur Z. And none of them do alternate history now. So there was this incubation phase of alternate history that everyone aged out of. And I know Monsieur Z and Alternate History Hub. And the shared reason between all of that is you can only do so many alternate histories that the audience actually cares about. You can talk about the world wars. You can talk about European history past a certain point. And for me, I stopped doing alternate history because I largely, and this is going to be brutal for the people who follow alternate history still, I see it almost as fan fiction for the real thing, where lots of writers start out writing fan fiction for another writer's work. Let's say you start out with Lord of the Rings fan fiction, and then you actually start writing real fantasy novels. And alternate history is a lot of fun. I don't want to disparage anyone who uses it as a hobby and who genuinely likes doing it, because it was what I did for 7 years. But I just past a certain point, I wanted to do something more serious. And I was stuck at home during COVID. And so I tried to work really hard to grow the channel. And past that point, I started moving towards the current kind of content I do, which is geopolitics, philosophy, anthropology, history. And I like to say that the kind of content that I do on the channel is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Chinese civilization, and will America have a civil war in the next 5 years? So I look to the patterns of history to try to figure out what the future might look like, and also why things happened in history. And about 3 years ago, the channel took off when I made that shift, and I dropped out of school, and now I do this channel full time.
Wow. Okay. So the alternative history, I think it's a sort of fun, geeky hobby. What would happen if aliens invaded? What if JFK wasn't assassinated?
Yeah.
It's kind of fun. History has always been a hobby of mine, just as I like old films about, the Roman Empire. I'm one of those guys who thinks about the Roman Empire and all that. And it's fun. And I guess for listeners and for me, there's a deeper reason, which is, yes, it's fun. But studying history and alternative history makes you think, all right, what are the assumptions I have about the world? I am not an isolated individual, which culturally we may be, we live in very individualistic cultures, a very individualistic time in history, I would say, right, compared to almost any other time in human history. But that point of view means we might forget the context. Like, we're in an environmental context, we're in a cultural context. I'm fascinated by culture. And we're in a historical context. And the cultural one, most of the embodiment people sort of get. I talk about a lot of my courses. If someone's from Ukraine, if someone's, America versus UK or Jewish background, they get. History is even more invisible than culture, though, because we can travel in culture, like you've traveled, I've traveled. I can go visit you in Boston now, and I'll go, oh, this is culturally different. I'll feel my Englishness, and what's my Irishness, I'd probably feel there as well. But we can't travel in time, actually. So it's even more invisible as the water we're in.
Yes, that's very true. We do travel in time to a certain degree, and that's aging, where my grandpa fought in World War II. And so the changes he saw over the course of his life would have to make someone realize that culture changes over time. And I mean, the easiest example of this, and the example that we so often forget, is if you compare Indian civilization to Western, the assumption behind Indian civilization is that reality doesn't exist, that everything is illusion spun by the gods. And so until the 1990s, the policy of the Indian government was that removing poverty was actually a selfish thing to do because poverty was a spiritual problem, not a material one. And that's something Gandhi very strongly believed. And Gandhi was against industrialization because he thought it would destroy the spiritual soul of India. And that's not something you think about until you see the cultural difference. Or look to Japan in World War II, where the Japanese viewed surrendering as an abomination. And so when anyone else surrendered, they thought they forfeited the honor of their lives. So the Japanese would kill prisoners of war because of that. And you don't notice these changes until you see them actually in the real world. And it's one of those things where I'd say, especially today, because even though we're a globalized world, because the only real cultural powerhouse we have is America, it's very easy for people to not notice these underlying cultural differences because no one ever brings them up or talks about them.
Yes, yes. I think it's particularly true in America, where it's almost taboo to talk about culture and taboo to talk about cultural differences because people sort of somehow mistake that you're talking about racial differences or something like that. And, you know, I know you've had sort of various people kind of not like your politics and try and counsel you and all this sort of thing. And I'm sure I'll get stick just for hosting you. And I think a good portion of that is people not, so you're talking about Indian culture. You're talking about historical cultural trends. There's no race issue in there. It's simply that, like, there's different ways to be human and they trend throughout cultures and history.
And if you want to boil it down even further, if you want to look inside white Anglo-Americans, there are vast cultural differences among Anglo-Americans. British Americans in the northern and southern states they're as genetically distinct as different European countries. If you compare someone who from Kentucky to someone from Ohio, those are states right next to each other, but their cultures are vastly different. And so it's something and the UK is a great example. The UK is a small island, but if you take a scoos from Liverpool and compare them to someone only 3 hours away, who's a posh person from London, the cultural distance is truly massive.
Scouse is how it's pronounced. As someone who's born in Liverpool, but yeah, Scouse. Yeah, and I mean we have a different accent every 50 miles to the point hard to understand at certainly a working class level. And also, at what point in history would you say we're at? So huge question. You know, I've talked about decadence on this channel before. Some listeners may be familiar with that. Like, if you were to sort of summarize, like, where are we as a historical point in the West, as a sort of 95% of our listeners are in the West, the States, Germany, England, Holland. Where are we at as a point in history?
There's the civilizational cycle that Spengler developed, and I think it's useful in a lot of ways. And the best parallel, there are 3 parallels I use pretty commonly in my videos. One is of the French Revolution, one is of the 17th century, and the third one is of Republican Rome. And for what you said, I would say that we are most similar to Republican Rome, because for Western and Greco-Roman classical civilization, they have similar cycles. And so the similarity between them is large superpower republic rises to power. It unwittingly, through a series of 2 bloody wars, then it installs globalization, which results in rapid economic growth, but also the rise of incredible inequality. And with that inequality comes decadence, the breakdown of traditional values in religion, And people don't notice this. Once you kill a society's religion, you kill its social cooperation. You remove incentives for the upper classes to not oppress the lower classes. You remove incentives against corruption, etc. So the society is very wealthy, but it's also falling to corruption and social decay very quickly. And what happened with the fall of the Roman Republic is the two political parties, the optimates and the populares, became more and more radical until the society broke down. And then it wasn't even political differences, it was warlords and strong men leading behind people with their cults of personality. And I think that that is the best place where I could summarize our current social order.
Right. There's this idea in the culture of sort of progress and things always getting better and better. The sort of Star Trek view of the world, as opposed to the Dune view of the world, is how I summarized it on another podcast.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, yeah. So everything gets getting better. When people say, well, because it's the current year, you know, that's an explanation. There's always this march towards a more sort of liberal way of looking at things. So the interesting thing is, in history, no one agrees on anything, like any topic. Like I just heard a talk Niall Ferguson on trigonometry. It's a podcast I've been on as a guest that I like. And he's saying that he doesn't believe in cyclical views of history. He thinks that's a projection of the fact that we age, that humans are cyclical, is his take on it, that we have this aging.
I'll give a one sentence, maybe a 2 sentence reply to this. If you start with the principle that you shouldn't invade Russia, and the invasions of Russia have so often failed, that is the first principle. That means you can learn lessons from history. The question afterwards is how many lessons you can learn from history. And what I'd say is it's often useful to extrapolate principles from your personal life to the macro political level, because fundamentally nations are collections of individuals. And so if you look over your personal life, there are certain lessons you learn, like don't blow all your money in a single luxury binge. Don't be crazy people. And then you gather these lessons together to form wisdom over the course of your life. Societies do similar things. And I mean, one of the lessons I've learned is that slavery is not good. If a society has slavery, it will worsen the entire collective health of the society. On top of this, every communist society ever has failed. That should be a sort of telling lesson. And when you add these lessons together, that is a very useful, comprehensive guide to how the world operates. And you can either have that, because the thing on an individual level is that if you have no memory of the lessons of your life as an individual, people literally say you're insane. That is the definition of a mentally ill person. If you wake up today,
up is down, and you haven't realized.
If you wake up today and you're like, I have to try everything new. Let's change how green light, red light works for driving. I need to get a new job. People will literally put you in a mental ward, or they would 30 years ago. And the other thing I'd say to that is, I've never really heard an argument for Niall Ferguson's case. I've never heard an argument. It's one of those things where the social consensus behind it is very popular, but I've never heard a good argument besides that just doesn't sound likely. And the thing is, the natural world operates in loads of cycles. You have animal populations go through booms and busts, and in between them, periods of conflict. The natural world goes through seasons. And fundamentally, human history is an extension of the natural world. So if human history is an extension of the natural world, why wouldn't it have cycles and noticeable patterns like the natural world?
Yes. I mean, any of the embodiment crowd listening to this will be deeply into cycles, whether it's the breath cycle, the life cycle. A lot of female teachers, it's the menstrual cycle. Like, that's a very common thing for sort of pagan influenced embodiment people to be into. So why shouldn't that exist? You know, everything from the breath to the life to history, why shouldn't that exist at all kind of levels? And there's definite parallels. Like there seems to be things that cluster. In the same way as people can learn from their own life, and that's called wisdom. You can learn from the lives of other wise people. That's definitely wiser than just making every single, do I have to run the heroin experiment? Probably not. I've seen heroin addicts. It doesn't look good. I've run the alcohol experiment personally, but not the heroin one, you know? And then can we extend that to what can I, is there wise voices throughout history? Are there lessons? Don't invade Russia unless you're Mongolian, of course, though, Rudyard.
Yeah.
There's always an exception, right? There's times. This point of sort of decadence of cultures that may be in decline, certain things get weird in cultures in decline. Sort of hedonism replaces meaning, that there's this idea of just having a good time rather than a religion. Replacement weird religions come in. I've sort of mentioned woke as a kind of replacement religion, a kind of belief system. And the view of the body changes as well. People start looking at the body as a sort of a much less solid thing, is my sense, in decadent cultures. It's a much more, what would be your sense in how the body is looked at in cultures in decline?
Before I get to there is a point I need to make to jump to the point I'm going to make, where there are two forms of selection in society. There's Darwinistic and sexual selection, where Darwinistic is, I need to do this, or the tribe next door with sharper spears will kill all of us. Sexual selection is, I need to improve how I dress in order to attract a mate. And these two operate in different ways. And in a healthy society, sexual selection is a proxy for Darwinistic selection. What happens once you remove external threats is that sexual selection, so it's survival and popularity, is that once you remove external threats, popularity becomes a force in its own right that can go in crazy directions because it's not moored to reality. And what happens in a lot of decadent cultures is that crazy things are pushed because it's a demonstration of how little you need to survive. And for the Greeks and the Romans, or for the Romans especially, they had their insane decadence of importing ostrich meat from Africa, or they'd literally bring ice from the Alps to make ice cream in the middle of the summer. And so they do all this crazy stuff. And it's a demonstration of how far you are from
needing to be grounded in reality.
Yeah, basically. And I see some of our politics we have today as being similar, where we reject all of the previous trappings of the older society, partly as a demonstration of how we don't need them because we're so successful. Rob Henderson, I believe, calls it luxury beliefs.
Yeah, luxury beliefs is something I've heard of. Yeah, like, so it's not just historical things; it's actually what you can afford to believe about the world.
Yes, and you also see the development of bizarre patterns where people push things that they know aren't true as a kind of social shit test to see, are you part of the group? And this is something religions do a lot, where religions will make onerous sacrifices of the members of the religion, so to make sure that you're part of the people who are willing to sacrifice a lot for for example, for a lot of Muslim and Jewish religions, if you are willing to get circumcised, that is a big enough sacrifice to justify you being in the religion.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I've had the end of my dick chopped off for this. It must be important. I mean, there's a
basically
dissonance and anything else, isn't there?
Yeah, and so and so in times of decadence, you see a decline in humanism because Mark and I were DMing each other, and I was talking about how love of the body is correlated with humanism, which makes sense because if you love the human form, that should mean you love humanity as a abstract. And the Greeks and the Romans and the Renaissance are good periods of that. The problem with decadence is that it becomes difficult to be a humanist once you realize how flawed humanity is. And so when you see people around you who are constantly in complete degeneracy, you lose track of what humanity means as a concept. And so what often happens with decadence is the society pushes itself into the dirt. You see a dark age or a series of wars, and then out of that comes a religious revival. And that process can often take centuries to play out. So I'm not going to say that this would happen in our lifetimes or even our grandkids' lifetimes. But decadence shows the degeneracy of the human form, which then results in people viewing the body as less important. And also the process of decadence is the process of not viewing the body as a temple, because there are certain societies that view the body as a holy temple to be preserved. as like almost a duty to God. And when you're in a decadent society where you're constantly misusing your body, that notion goes away.
Okay, let's just slow this down a little bit. So a few views of the body through history, different cultures, different points in
Yeah.
history. One might be the sort of the body as a sort of sacred representation of God. Like
Yes.
you're made in God's image. So to tattoo yourself, or, you know, very common now, to abuse yourself physically in some way is actually kind of a sin in a religious culture
Yes.
that sees the body. Other cultures throughout history have been more like, hey, the body's just an illusion. It's Maya. It's
Yeah.
about transcending the body. So if you're suffering, you know, the body's in pain. You know, you'll see this in people in various forms of Asian Buddhism, for example. You'll see this as well as the more body kind of body accepting kind of parts of Buddhism. There's kind of both trends in Buddhism.
Yeah.
Uh, and then there's also like, hey, nothing really matters. The body's just a sort of pleasure delivery device for me because
Yeah.
there's no meaning, there's no religion. I remember I was teaching in Belgium this year, and I said, who would die for Belgium? And everyone just laughed out loud. And it was literally only 100 years ago that the King of Belgium was literally going to fight on the front lines of the trenches.
They fought super hard in World War One.
It meant something to people 100
Yeah.
years ago. And they literally laughed out loud when I said die for Belgium, you know, because I was trying to figure out what does this mean to these people? Do they have a national belief system, even if it's not a religious one, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to kind of pass out some of these different views of the body throughout
There's
history.
several others as well. Um, there's viewing the body as disgusting, which is something you see in other religious societies. And there's also viewing the body, there's viewing the body as a beautiful thing, which is something you see in humanist societies. Like when societies are painting the nude form, that's a sign that the body is in of itself a beautiful thing.
So in Western culture, there is this strong tradition of sculpting, painting the body. So, you know, Greek statues, everyone loves
Yes.
Michelangelo's David kind of thing. I've got a picture just up there of it. And then there's another tradition in Western societies of the body sort of dirty and sinful and should be denied. You know, they sort of cover up as much of the body as possible in religions, for example. Yeah, so we kind of have both trends, don't we, in the West, of sort of body celebrating and body denying. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, you see this sort of thing in societies all the time. It's because you need to have two counteracting trends to balance out. And so in Western society, there's the cross current, there's the duality of Christianity and the barbarian spirit. And we jump between the two of them depending on where we need to be. And in China, it's Buddhism/Taoism versus Confucianism. And those societies need to have two conflicting belief structures to jump between to provide psychological balance. And so what you're describing is the Greco-Roman versus the Christian heritage, where it's faith in the human condition and also whatever the opposite of faith in the human condition is. Because one of them views humanity as a positive thing that can attain its own goals when it wants to, and the other views humanity is dependent upon God.
Kind of original sin versus original goodness kind of thing.
Or I don't even think original goodness. Like it's the concept that humans are great, which is what the Greeks and the Romans had. But the Greeks and the Romans didn't believe humanity was good. They believed it could be great.
Okay.
Prometheus is the best example, where Prometheus, he was not a good, he brought fire down from the gods, partly out of goodwill. But when people talk about Promethean, they don't mean good. They mean the potential to do incredible things.
So in the embodiment world, there's this huge meeting of different cultural views of the body.
Yeah.
So there may be some, you know, very Asian influenced people in the embodiment world. Japanese martial arts was a big influence on me, for example, and Thai Buddhism was another one. And in Thai Buddhism, you'll find the body is disgusting and contemplating the ugliness of the body, but you'll also find a lot of body-based meditation, you know, to feel the body. And in the Japanese culture, you'll find a lot of, you know, austerities of the body, standing under cold waterfalls and doing something 5,000 times and sort of transcend the body.
Yes.
They're just two influences. We've also got an embodiment, the pagan influence on the body. It's kind of that's a strong influence in this community. And then you've got all the invisible, implicit ones, just because you grew up in Canada and you didn't know it didn't know that all these things are going on until you talk to someone from China or Saudi Arabia, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we got real different views here.
Yeah, definitely.
Any more thoughts on sort of some of those collisions? Because in the embodiment world, I do see these cultural and historical trends as in different kinds of tension. You know, like I went to one's a Western Zen retreat, and everyone was told to wear black, and several young women just immediately put flowers in their hair while wearing all black clothes, and it was clear there was kind of like two different traditions playing out in some way.
Yeah. I mean, inside the Western world, you see vastly disparate views on this stuff, where tattooing is a great example you used of where if you're, and again, tattooing changes widely across culture. There are cultures where tattooing is spiritual. The ancient Celts are a great example. But in our society, that's not the case, where you were getting this tattoo because you see your body as something to impart your individuality upon. And so if you're in a very conservative place, you will see that as defiling God's creation and perfection and God, and that you do not belong, your body does not belong to yourself, it belongs to God. And so that's something we see, but also across history. If you compare the Middle Ages to the present, medieval societies had vastly different social standards, where semi-public sex was common in the Middle Ages. People would have sex in front of their families, in front of their neighbors, and it wasn't seen as taboo, because in Christianity, there's nothing that actively against that. Christianity says, keep sex inside marriage. They don't give more details. And they also viewed humanity as animals. They viewed us as fallen animals that we're still going to fail and still going, and that you had the standards imparted by the church, but outside of that, you could do what you wanted. And then with modernity and the concept that humanity had to progress, you then had the idea that humans had to get progressively higher standards. And what I described there is in relation to disgust sensitivity. And there's a great book called The History of Manners by Norbert Elias, which sounds really boring, but it's actually a fascinating book. And it goes through how manners changed over Western history. And what it showed is an increased disgust sensitivity from the Middle Ages forward. And the reason for that is that back in the Middle Ages, you could do stuff like that because your entire social network was people in your village who you probably grew up with. So there was a degree of familiarity. In the modern world, you're dealing with massive interconnected capitalist or communist systems where you're constantly having to deal with strangers. And so stuff like that would be disgusting to us because it's a person we don't know and we don't have that sense of familiarity. And disgust sensitivity goes up the more complicated this is. And this is something we've seen across previous civilizations as well. Wearing deodorant's an example. If you're a tribal people, wearing deodorant doesn't matter because you know everyone around you. In our current society, human scent is it carries a lot of information. This is going to sound strange, but human scent carries a lot of information with it. And so if you're constantly walking around a giant city, you're picking up on people's scents, that's going to distract you. And so societies start using deodorant once they're past a certain degree of complexity. And this occurred to the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Chinese, or in certain phases of their history. Because you have to lessen the disgust once the society gets past a certain threshold of size.
Yeah, nice. And disgust is a very important emotion for things like genocide. So
yeah.
And from an embodiment point of view, taste and smell are slightly different senses because something has to go into the body. Like it's kind of already too late by the time we're tasting it. Do you know what I mean? Whereas you can look at
definitely,
it and it's not inside you. So there's a slightly different internal. I mean, even that's a historical distinction. What's in and outside the body, the barrier, the edge of the body. That's a
fascinating medieval concept where in the Middle Ages they viewed. This is the thing, Charles Taylor, who wrote a book called The Secular Age, which compares the medieval versus the modern views of the world. And in the modern world, we have the idea of the buffered personality, that everyone is a distinct individual. And when a change happens, it's due to the individual's change in their psychology, where if you have a mental health issue in the modern world, it's due to some problems in your life. In the Middle Ages, they had a concept that spirits would alternate between populations and that mental health was a collective problem. And in some ways, I think the medieval vision is better because most mental health is a community problem, because the factors that contribute to people's happiness from studies we found recently are community, religion, how chaotic their economic lives are. Economics is important. Or being out of poverty is important, but it's how unstable your life is, and interpersonal, like friend connections, and those are things the individual can control to a certain degree, but fundamentally it's the community. Those are things that on a group level have to be orchestrated by the community, and once those things fail, you'll see community failings in the entire society's mental health. And I think people my age are a great example of that, where Gen Z has horrible mental health because there was the collapse in all of the factors I described above.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is in the UK and many Western countries, we're hitting a mental health apocalypse, frankly. Just increasingly hearing about children killing themselves and drug addiction in young people, way, way different than when I was young. And I'm just seeing, I went to the public library in this small, nice rural town I live in, and the biggest section, the most hired out section was books on mental health. And the librarian told me, like, everyone's crazy, everyone's hiring these books. That's why they're at the front, right at the front of the library. And some of that's greater social acceptance of kind of issues around mental health. But my sense is on a communal level, things are breaking down. It's too much for people. And then they're like, yeah, but use this mindfulness app or do this yoga class. And it's like, no, sorry, the fucking issues are way bigger than that. And yes, it could be great to do some mindfulness or do a yoga class. And those of us who are practitioners of embodiment are often sort of, putting a bit of a band-aid over a gaping wound of historical society is the sense like increasingly we get.
Definitely. I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I made an hour-long video on that subject where I think we are on the verge of a mental health apocalypse. And you see it in a bunch of things we don't view as mental health. It's why our politics are so crazy. It's why our culture, our pop culture is so crazy. It's why everyone's depressed, why Gen Z doesn't function, etc.
And is there anything new in modern culture? So sometimes you hear this cliche that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. There's the sense of you see some things that, like the obsession. One of the favorite ones is we have celebrity chefs, and so did the Romans. We have overpaid sports people, and so did the Romans. We have a breakdown in sort of gender norms and gender polarity, and that's very typical in decades. Yes. Is there anything that sort of the postmodern, hyper individual, hyper subjective, maybe techno, the technology's new, right? Is anything that brings that's pretty new to history?
I call history the twisted mirror, and I view history as like DNA. It's warping in on itself, getting bigger, but you will see things that are very new and very old in every era of history. And I like to say that modern society is a combination of it's a combination of Blade Runner with the 1600s, because we have all of this cyberpunk technology, big tech companies run everything, but also there's some very medieval stuff where cancel culture is basically witch burnings, or I view the political divide as a religious war, or the Turks or the French are fighting over Libya. That's like something over this that would happen 400 years ago. And so you see very old and very new things in different eras of history. And so with new things that happen, there are historic parallels, where I think a parallel to the internet would be the printing press. Both massively spread information, but I don't want to discount the internet's really new. And you could make that connection, but that doesn't discount how innovative the internet is. And I think the cell phone and the digital world we live in is very new. There aren't that many good historic parallels to it. And when I look at Gen Z and how they can't socialize and how they're, and I'm Gen Z, so I'm hating on my own people. They can't socialize. They've got severe mental health issues and all that. That's not something you really see beforehand in history, because you needed to socialize, because that was how you did everything. Now you can DoorDash things and work from remotely. And so because all of that, that's a very new thing. And also being in a society without a fear of with obesity, that's very new. And we are the only society ever where more people are obese than hungry. And so there are a lot of things that you don't see before in history.
Yeah, yeah. Some things in the 30 Years' War or whatever are familiar, some things not.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like you can't learn from history, but you can learn quicker from the present if you know some history. It seems
Yeah.
it's like this sort of like, oh, maybe that's a repetition, or oh, maybe that's a pattern. Often I sort of hold it as a maybe. Do you know what I mean? Like this looks a
Yeah.
little bit like the fall of Rome, but there are some changes.
I mean, I think taking responsibility for your own actions is one of the most important things. And whenever you use a mental tool too much, you're actively abdicating responsibility for your own judgment. And this is what I say with history. You have to make a decision for your decisions, your country's decisions, and you must make that decision based upon what the reality of your current life is. If you're pulling too much on the past, what you're doing is you are abdicating actually making the decision, because you can always look to the past and say, from that precedent, I am in the clear. I don't have to worry because I look to the precedent and now if it doesn't work, that's not my problem. That's the system's problems. And I mean, it's just like real life. In real life, you can look back um, and think to yourself, this new job is kind of like an old job I did, but it's still a new job and you have to deal with it as it actually exists in the real
Yeah.
world.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
the
Like
way I view
that
it,
problem gets bigger as you get older because you've got more
it's
past.
yeah. And the thing I like is that it's stressful and each generation is a new thing. But I think as myself, imagine if our ancestors solved all the problems 500 years ago. That would rob the entire future of history of adventure, of choice, of independence. That would be an atrocity. And so I'm thankful that the world's constantly throwing new crap at us because it keeps the game interesting. And ancient cultures like to say, the gods and spirits envy how hard our lives are because it gives us reality and it gives us something to wake up in the morning for.
Yeah, I could do it a bit less hard now, to be honest with you. But
I feel
I do get that. I do get that. And what about this trend towards sort of the body, the physical body isn't important at all? Has this ever existed before? Like you'll hear people say, I identify as something now, meaning the
yeah, that stems from Gnosticism. Um, a lot of the left's philosophic substructure is Gnostic. And it's one of those things where one of my personal views is it's impossible to not be religious because you need to have some understanding of how the world works in your head. Even if you don't realize it, it'll end up becoming you will end up acting as if it was a religion. And I use communism as an example, where communists, if you challenge their worldview, they will defend it with as much certainty as a Catholic arguing at the Virgin Mary. And
yeah.
and so the idea that the body has no meaning stems from Gnosticism indirectly. And the Gnostics were a religion in this is going to sound really schizo, but the Gnostics were a religion in the ancient Middle East they were a philosophic undercurrent for all of Western history. And this is not a conspiracy theory where we have loads of records of
Yeah.
Gnostic philosophic associations around Europe into the 1800s. And because this is a society that was very religious, every educated person knew a certain degree of religious philosophy. And the Gnostics view our soul as independent from the physical world. And so what that translates to is that your soul is free, trapped in a evil conspiratorial world. And this is the argument for the body not mattering with transgender people, is that my soul is independent from my body because I have a true soul, which is a different gender. And it stems from that philosophic trajectory of thinking.
So I'm an X trapped in such and such a body. Yeah.
Basically.
It's very Descartesian, I always think, as well. It's sort of like this utterly separate thing. But
Yes.
there's been very little challenge from the embodiment community about this, I think, because it almost has a religious quality. And, also people just want to be kind to people who are in difficult situations,
Yes.
maybe are suffering a lot, which is understandable and I support. I guess we're left in this situation of postmodernity plus tech. We're no longer grounded in the body, just kind of mindfully because of various factors of comfort, because of various philosophical factors. there's a trend towards not being in the body and saying you're not your body for various reasons. We don't have a religion. You know, Nietzsche was the first to say God is dead, and this is going to cause some problems down the line, guys. And sort of Western culture's riding in the kind of what would be the word? It's been surfing the religious wave that is now ended.
Yeah.
And we're left sort of at the point in history just kind of going, what do we believe in? What do we believe? You can't be sort of nationalistic in the modern context very easily. It's difficult unless you're going to go hardcore fundamentalist. It's difficult to be religious when there's 6 different religions on the street you live on. I mean, what do we believe in this point in history?
I have to get going in 5 minutes, but I have an interesting point around this where for all of Western history for the last 1,000 years, every era has called itself modernity. And so in the 11th century, they called themselves the modern age because the idea was the ancient world existed. And then once you got Christianity, you became modernity. And the idea with modernity was that it progressed towards the kingdom of heaven. And so the medieval era, they called themselves modernitas, and then they contrasted with the ancient world. Then the period we call modernity started with the Renaissance, and then they created the Middle Ages, and then they were modern. And then the shift from modern to postmodern, I think, means something very profound in the Western mind, because I think the subconscious realization is, wait, we achieved all of our goals and we're not happy. And so we have done with this modern experiment that we've been doing for the last 1,000 years. And now we're just, what do we do now? And I can't answer your question, Mark, because it would take the greatest genius of our time to answer that question.
I'm just desperately nihilistic and slightly depressed at the moment is probably why I'm asking.
I'm sorry. I mean, the thing is, like, the man who discovers what you are asking will change the course of history. And so, yeah, it's like because one of the things you see across history, the civilizational cycle Spengler talks about, is that after you have the religious period, then you have a religious reformation. And I'm moving these terms to be more like the Western context, but these occurred pretty differently in other societies. Religious period, Reformation, Age of Reason. After the Age of Reason comes an age of materialism, nihilism, and then a new religion. And so, I mean, these things take centuries to play out, or not, maybe not a new religion. It might be another religion from another part of the world. It might be a reworking of the previous religion. But there has to be a solution because our society is so nihilistic. But at the same time, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, pretty sure I just heard you say start a cult. Great, thanks for the advice. Before we close, just give us 1 or 2 weird facts about the body from history. Like, I love the one medieval people didn't think it was weird having sex in front of others. Just a couple of little nuggets of little historical.
Okay, I'll fire some at you. Back in the Greco-Roman world, or this is kind of tangentially related. When people look at Greek and Roman statues, they think that they were naturally white. Well, the reality is they were colored because the Greeks and the Romans didn't like the idea of any bodily surface being uncovered. They thought it was weird to not have paint a human body. Besides that, you had in Indian society, I mean, this is something you touched on before, there was the concept that you, as an aesthetic, you should transcend the human body. And so Indian sages would do stuff like sit on top of a pole for years straight, or they would freeze themselves to death, or not freeze themselves to death. In Buddhism, there's a comparable thing where you block yourself off in a cave for years straight. And through that process of disconnection, because there's a little hole to give you food, you can apparently access spiritual powers you couldn't access before and see more of the cosmos. And so there was this custom in Tibetan Buddhism of locking yourself in a cave to basically leave the physical world for years straight.
Yep. People still do that. Tibetan monks and nuns in 3-year retreats, and sort of the yoga poses, like tree poses, standing on one leg. People might have done that for a year, not for 5 minutes in the yoga class, and a very different point of view is coming from. Well, thank you so much. I found this fascinating. I know you had to head off. It felt very dense, loads there. I'd point listeners to a couple of things on your channel they may like, the good starting points. First thing I'd say is our sort of more American progressive listeners may find some of it upsetting. They might say that Rudyard's a sort of, crazy alt-right guy, not a real historian, blah, blah. I'd say, cool, maybe, but just look at his stuff, see if it actually makes sense. Give it a listen. There's other historians, other people out there who can give you different points of view, like, I don't know, Niall Ferguson I mentioned. So I'd say, in our polarized world, it could be good to have a few different kinds of voices out there. And I certainly find your videos very watchable. I like your ones on sort of inconvenient psychological truths, the sort of things that you're not allowed to say, the unsayables. I find those very attractive. The taboos, videos on taboos, I think people should look for. And also your ones on emotions that are sort of understated, like envy.
That's my favorite. My favorite video I've ever made is the one in 7 Emotions.
Yeah, and a lot of those are driving people, and a lot of us coaches and yoga teachers, whatever, just don't pretend like envy's not a thing, and it's fucking huge, just as one of the things. Yeah. Rudyard, where do people find you? Where do they go?
Just go on my YouTube channel at Whatifalthist.
Whatifalthist. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Total pleasure.